All right. Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome as you start to filter in for our Trouble Begins series. As always, we love to hear where people are from, so feel free to share in the chat where you are tuning in from tonight. Welcome to the Mark Twain House's Trouble Begins with John Muller for his lecture on the lost history of Mark Twain and Frederick Douglass. I am Mallory Howard. I'm the assistant curator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. And once again, thank you for joining us. We are excited to host you tonight for this virtual event. And as a reminder, there will be a replay of this event available afterwards on our Trouble Begins YouTube playlist, which is accessible through our website at www.marktwainhouse.org. And at the end of the program, we will take a few minutes to answer some questions from the audience. So if you do have questions that you think of during the presentation, if you go to the bottom of your screen, please make sure you enter them in that Q&A box that you see below there. It's a lot easier for us to grab your questions. Before we get started tonight, I would like to thank our sponsors for the 2024 Trouble Begin season, Kathleen and David Jimenez. And so now let us introduce our guest. John Muller is the author of Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C., The Lion of Anacostia, and Mark Twain in Washington, D.C., The Adventures of a Capital Correspondent. He has presented widely throughout the Washington, D.C. and Baltimore metropolitan areas and Maryland's Eastern Shore at venues including the Library of Congress, Enoch Pratt Free Library, D.C. Public Library, Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, which if you've never been there, highly recommend, and local universities. Muller has previously presented on Mark Twain in Washington City at the Mark Twain House in Hartford, and he is a frequent guest on DC and Baltimore radio and broadcast stations, and has been featured on C-SPAN's Book TV and C-SPAN's American History TV. He lives in Columbia, Maryland, with his wife and 2 children. So with that being said, John, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mallory. Let me cue up the slides. Hopefully everyone can see. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is 40 slides. I'm going to try to finish around 7:45, so we have time for questions, comments, discussion. It's an honor to be here this evening. I did have occasion to speak at the Mark Twain House in Hartford, Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, I believe in 2014 or so. For those of you who like to travel, if you have not been to the Mark Twain House, I encourage you to go. It should be on like your bucket list. It's wonderful staff there. It's a wonderful home. My favorite room was the billiards room. And I took a photo of this. I couldn't find it for the presentation, but when I was kind of looking around the house, I did find on the shelves there was a copy of Life and Times, which was Frederick Douglass's last autobiography. So Twain and Douglass shared multiple connections and relationships, and they met on several occasions. And I'm going to just try to keep this presentation as succinct as possible. There is much more that could be included. Some of these slides could be their own presentations. I'm sure there are some people who are attending tonight who are much more knowledgeable about Mr. Twain than myself. So I hope that this presentation kind of continues the discussion and investigation and research into the lives of these 2 gentlemen and how they interacted. All right. So I can't help myself, but I'm going to be a little discursive tonight, and I will discuss Twain and Douglass and their relationship to the gentleman on the far right, who's George Alfred Townsend. And yes, Twain and Douglass knew each other, as I can determine, for about 25, if not 30 years. And Frederick Douglass actually knew Twain's in-laws for much longer than that, and I will get into that with no further ado. All right. Known throughout the country and world as two of the most recognized Americans of the 19th century, Mark Twain and Frederick Douglass shared numerous associations and friendships across generations and geography. An interesting fact, some may know that in recent years it has been determined that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century, more so than Lincoln, more so than Whitman, and more so than Twain, and only more so than Twain because many of the photographs of Mark Twain are taken post 1900. But Frederick Douglass and Mark Twain, fortunately, were photographed many times, and we have a great visual record of their lives across decades. First meeting sometime in the 1860s, Twain and Douglass maintained mutual connections and engaged similar allies within literary, political, and reform networks throughout New England, New York, and Washington City across decades. How many times Twain and Douglass may have rode in the same dining car out west or back east, passed each other in the halls of Congress or in the lobby of the Willard Hotel or on the streets of Washington City or Hartford, Connecticut, chatted in hotel lobbies, attended each other's lectures, or been in the same audience at receptions, celebrations, and philanthropic events held throughout the country's principal cities continues to be a focus of ongoing research. In recent years, a bibliography has begun to emerge connecting Twain and Douglass beyond their well-known correspondence concerning Twain's letter to President-elect James Garfield in 1881, supporting the reappointment of Frederick Douglass as United States Marshal of the District of Columbia. I would say up until about 10 years ago, that was the foundation of Twain and Douglass scholarship. So we've begun to kind of move beyond that letter, which Albert Bigelow Paine even included Douglass's letter to Mark Twain in Bigelow Paine's biographies. So this connection concerning Twain, Garfield, and Douglass has been known within the field of Douglassonian studies since Philip Boner's 1950 biography featured this letter. In 2017, Dwayne Utsi contributed an article to the Center for Mark Twain Studies featuring Douglass and Twain's correspondence over this letter to President-elect Garfield. A series of several supplementary articles by Dr. Matt Siebold of the Center for Mark Twain Studies Center in 2021 around an 1880 Emancipation Day address that Frederick Douglass delivered in Elmira, New York, including the article, quote, "If He Weren't My Friend, Frederick Douglass and Mark Twain," end quote, has been some of the most thorough scholarship to emerge connecting Frederick Douglass and Mark Twain. Definitely wanted to give a shout out to Dr. Siebold, and if you're not familiar with those articles, simple Google search or going to the Mark Twain Center for Mark Twain Study Center website, you can find there's several articles, and they're all very, very well done and very thorough. And so I highly recommend for Twainiacs and Douglassonians being familiar with that scholarship. Continued research and collaboration between Twainiacs and Douglassonians is helping to better understand their shared place and space within the ecosystem of activism, political canvassing, and lobbying, literature, and philanthropy across more than a quarter century. This evening, we will discuss Underground Railroad ties between Douglass and Twain's in-laws, the Langdon family of Buffalo and Elmira, New York, mutual correspondence with writer and author George Alfred Townsend, speaking tours with James Redpath's Lyceum, political canvassing and shared associations with presidents, members of Congress, and Washington City journalists, and more. The presentation will include ongoing research of a previously unknown meeting between Twain and Douglass that occurred in Connecticut in 1883, adding to the growing bibliography documenting the nuanced friendship of the two iconoclasts. All right, so I thought we'd start off the evening with the pride of Martins Ferry, Ohio, William Dean Howells on Frederick Douglass. This was actually published post Douglass's death in 1895. So William Dean Howells wrote, quote, "Douglass was essentially militant. He was a fighter from way back, from the hour when he conceived the notion that if the slave would always fight the man who attempted to whip him, there would be no whipping. And he did fight his master upon this theory and beat him. His war with slavery was to the death. Yet he laid himself open to the blame of certain abolitionists because he would not go all lengths with them, and he refused to take part in the attempt of John Brown, whom he loved with his whole heart. He kept amidst the tumult of his emotion the judicial mind, and he did not lose his head in the stormy career of the agitator." All right. So Douglass, in fact, knew Mark Twain's father-in-law before Mark Twain did. So Jervis Langdon, born in 1809, passed in 1870, father to Olivia Langdon, Mrs. Samuel Clemens, and Jervis Langdon was the father-in-law to Mark Twain. He aided Frederick Bailey in his escape out of slavery from Baltimore City in September 1838. So Frederick Douglass escapes via the railroad in Baltimore in 1838 and arrives in New York City, then eventually settles in Massachusetts. Douglass actually did not disclose the details of his escape until the 1880s. And even when Douglass shared the details, Douglass really never got into he was very cautious for many, many reasons to disclose how he escaped, who aided him, kind of what methods he used. And so we still don't exactly know essentially how the Langdon family or Jervis Langdon aided Douglass, but the fact that he did aid Douglass, we know because Douglass maintained correspondence and thanked the Langdon family for their all the help that they provided him. So, yes. And Jervis Langdon is kind of like a Garrett Smith sort of individual where he was a successful businessman who was very philanthropic and supported causes of reform, and this included aiding Black Americans, and before emancipation, aiding fugitive slaves, and I'm not really familiar with Langdon enough to call him an abolitionist, but the fact that he participated in the Underground Railroad, I would say that he was pretty radical, and he was radical enough to help a radical Frederick Bailey escaping slavery. All right, so a couple months after Jervis Langdon passes away, Douglass writes a letter to Olivia Lewis Langdon, Olivia Langdon's mother, and Douglass writes, "Pardon the liberty, but as one who nearly 30 years ago learned something of the noble character of your lamented husband, I beg you to allow me to enroll myself among the many who today hold his name in history in grateful memory. If I had never seen nor heard of Mr. Langdon since the days that you and himself made me welcome under your roof in Millport, I should never have forgotten either of you. Those were times of ineffaceable memories with me, and I've carried the name of Jervis Langdon with me ever since. The record of his life as given in the address of his pastor has touched me deeply, and hence these few words. Please give my thanks to your dear son for sending me a copy of that address." Most likely that was Charles Langdon who sent Douglass that address. All right, so we're going to kind of move a little bit back and forth in chronology. We'll get back into the Langdon family, but nonetheless, some of this presentation is more questions than answers. Some of it is speculative. Some of it is discussing what is potentially historically possible. So for those of you who have read Mark Twain in Washington, D.C., you're familiar with this print. This print is of Newspaper Row, which is today kind of like 14th and 14th Street in downtown Washington, D.C., between F and Pennsylvania Avenue. And this was an area that Mark Twain, when he arrived in Washington, D.C. as a journalist in late November 1867, staying in Washington until March 1868, Twain would walk from the U.S. Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue over to Newspaper Row, where he would telegraph his dispatches and or mail his dispatches. Frederick Douglass does not settle in Washington until the early 1870s, but he's frequently in and out of Washington giving lectures at local churches, meeting with politicians. We have not yet gotten to the 15th Amendment by the late 1860s, but Douglass is a frequent presence in Washington. So I don't have any evidence to confirm that Douglass and Twain may have met in like a Washington, D.C. bookstore at this time, that they may have passed each other in an omnibus on Pennsylvania Avenue, but their times in Washington do initially overlap in this about 4-month period. I just haven't been able to confirm that they met. So this in itself could be a whole discursive, speculative presentation, but I'll just try to skip through this. So the first time that we know of Twain mentioning Douglass in his letters is in 1869. Twain is writing to Olivia Langdon from, I believe this is from Rhode Island. So he writes, Quote, had a talk with Fred Douglass today, who seemed exceedingly glad to see me, and I certainly was glad to see him, for I do so admire his spunk. He told me the history of his child's expulsion from Miss Tracy's school, and his simple language was very effective. Douglass is talking about his youngest daughter, Rosetta, and her inability to kind of attend a school in Rochester, New York. Miss Tracy said the pupils did not want a colored child among them, which she did not believe, and challenged the proof. She put it at once to a vote of the school and asked, how many of you are willing to have a colored child be with you? And they all held up their hands. Douglass added, the children's hearts were right. There was pathos in the way he said it. I would like to hear him make a speech. Had a grand face. The footnotes to this letter, which the Mark Twain Project at UC Berkeley has digitized many of these letters, and there are some real great databases and resources for Twain scholars. And it's believed that this interaction may have happened in Boston, Massachusetts. So this alludes to their first meeting, but I believe it's possible they've met before this. But nonetheless, we know that Twain and Douglass by late 1860s have at least shaken hands. They've acknowledged each other in the crowd, and they've had this discussion. They've had a discussion. All right, so Douglass and Twain really travel all over the place. Twain traveled all over the world. So did Douglass, but Douglass never visited Japan or Australia as Twain did. But within the United States, they're frequently taking the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that connected Washington, D.C. to 13 states. This is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's Washington branches. This is the New Jersey Avenue train station. Operated from 1851 until October 1907, when Union Station replaced it. So when Twain first comes to Washington as Samuel Clemens in 1854, he arrives via this train station. When he's in and out of Washington, lobbying Congress, visiting D.C., he's coming in and out of this train station. Here's another photo of this here. So Mark Twain was a frequent visitor to Washington City during the years after to join as a capital correspondent. Twain's main point of interest and departure from Washington City was the Washington Depot. Could Twain and Douglass have shared conversation while awaiting departing trains, or maybe even they were on the same dining car, let's say coming from Wheeling, West Virginia, and visiting Washington? And so this is more so a question than an answer. So this is kind of interesting also. So Matthew Brady's, I apologize, some of these images are a little blurry, but nonetheless, this is an advertisement for Brady's National Portrait Gallery, 625 Pennsylvania Avenue between 6th and 7th Street. This gallery contains a collection of American and European celebrities, unrivaled on this continent, portraits of eminent men and women on exhibition and for sale. Old pictures restored and copied to any desired size. So Douglass and Twain sat on several occasions for photographs in Matthew Brady's photo studio at 7th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. The building has been preserved today. Most recently, it was Dr. Dorothy I. Height's office for the National Council for Negro Women, and it's still there today. And Brady's photography studio was on the top floor, where you have the turrets. Before the advent of electricity, natural light would come in and provide the light needed for the photographs. So very little is actually known on Matthew Brady outside of two biographical profiles that George Alfred Townsend wrote, and Brady is today buried in Washington, D.C. at Congressional Cemetery. So to the left, this is a pretty well-known photograph of my main man, George Alfred Townsend, to the left, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain in the middle, David Gray of Buffalo, New York to the right, and then on your right is a photograph of Frederick Douglass taken in Matthew Brady's studio. Douglass sat for Brady at least a half dozen times. Some Twainiacs out there may know how many times Twain sat for Matthew Brady photographs, but I believe it's at least 3 or 4 times. But if I'm incorrect there, please make a comment in the chat function or Q&A. And so I don't know that they had their photograph taken on the same day, but nonetheless, this is another kind of mutual shared connection and contact, or at least even like a place that we know Twain and Douglass both frequented. when I was doing the Mark Twain and DC book, the wonderful reference librarians at the Library of Congress were kind enough to pull this out of the vault. This is actually the kind of login book for Matthew Brady's photo studio, and this is actually written in Samuel Clemens of Buffalo, New York, his own hand, and then George Alfred Townsend of Washington, D.C. in his own hand. So George Alfred Townsend was roommates with Mark Twain when he was in Washington, D.C. Townsend maintained correspondence with Mark Twain for several decades. For those of you familiar with the bibliography of George Alfred Townsend, the Tales of the Chesapeake has included in the book jacket a letter of support from his old roommate, Mark Twain. George Alfred Townsend frequently visited Frederick Douglass at Cedar Hill. Townsend was a Republican mouthpiece in the press. He wrote positively about Republicans. He wrote a biography on Levy Morton in 1888 when he was running for vice president. Townsend covered the Republican National Conventions. And so Townsend is kind of this, in a triangular, let's say, relationship. Townsend is close with Twain. Townsend is close with Douglass. When Twain and Townsend meet, did they say, hey, have you seen our friend Fred? You know, how's Mr. Douglass doing? When Douglass sees Townsend, he may say, hey, have you heard from our friend Samuel Clemens? What's his latest literary project, or what speeches is he giving? So I really love George Alfred Townsend. I'm fascinated by this guy. He has basically been forgotten today, whereas when he was a contemporary with Mark Twain, some may argue that Townsend was maybe even in their lives a larger literary figure. Townsend deployed humor in his writing, but in a little bit of a different way than Twain. Townsend was known as a straight reporter or a street reporter, whereas Mr. Twain kind of abandoned journalism more for writing books and giving lectures. So this is an interesting anecdote from December 1872. After President Ulysses S. Grant has been reelected, there are kind of different factions within the Black community. On one side is Frederick Douglass. On another side is John Mercer Langston, kind of saying, hey, these are the slate of gentlemen I'd like to be appointed to, you know, open post office positions, open customs house positions. And so when Townsend writes this, he writes pretty unfavorably about John Mercer Langston, and some of the language is maybe not appropriate for today, but I'll just read. Townsend closes his article with an anecdote about Frederick Douglass, saying, Fred Douglass comes from the eastern shore of Maryland and has a good oystery nature about him. He opens up well. So just as Mark Twain had items, kind of his own, like personal merchandise, Townsend also had personal merchandise. This is a cigar tin that can be found in the small museum at Gathland State Park in Burkittsville, Maryland. All right, so the Willard Hotel to the left is Peacock Alley, where we know Twain was conspicuous on his visits to Washington. Frederick Douglass would frequently attend meetings on district suffrage, local Republican Party meetings in the Willard Hotel. I do not know that Douglass and Twain, Douglass did not drink really, but I do not know that they necessarily shared a dining table at the Willard. But this is another place that both of them were known to frequent, and it's possible that they had some interactions or connections in these locations in Washington. All right, so back to the Langdon family. The following letter, this is from 1872. The following letter in regard to the slight put upon Frederick Douglass by the president was written by the former to Charles Langdon of Elmira, New York. I'll just read this here. So Douglass is writing, my dear Mr. Dateline, August of 1872. My dear Mr. Langdon, I am obliged by your favor of the 9th of August. Absence from home is my apology for my silence. I believe in General Grant fully. There is something so ridiculous about this dinner affair that I really don't care to talk or write about it. So this is after Douglass is on the Santo Domingo mission, which is in the 1870s to possibly annex what is today the Dominican Republic. Douglass was not invited to the White House, and there was a big kerfuffle about this, and Douglass tried to minimize the impact. And so when he writes this letter to Charles Langdon, he writes it knowing that it's going to be used for public consumption. And as I was discussing before the presentation, Douglass had a real trust with members of the Langdon family. And I think that's pretty important, where going back to the letter that Twain writes to Olivia Langdon in 1869, I believe that when Twain is courting Olivia Langdon, Twain would have been aware that the Langdon family were favorable to the plight of Black Americans, that they were sympathetic to the advocacy of Black Americans to receive constitutional rights, that Twain would have known that the Langdon family were friends with Frederick Douglass. So Twain probably knew not to speak ill of Mr. Douglass because the Langdon family considered him a friend, or the Langdon family were allies across decades to Mr. Douglass. So that's a little bit of the context. I apologize for not explaining that. So Douglass writes, while it would have given me great pleasure to dine with our worthy president, and while an invitation to dine with him in the circumstances would have been a valuable fact against prevailing prejudices, I should be ashamed to charge the omission to invite me as an offense against me or my race. The president was under no obligation to invite me to dine with him. It was a matter in which he had a perfect right to act free from outside guidance or outside criticism. So just skip ahead. I may be forced to say a word more to the public on the subject, but I would rather avoid it. It is enough that I am with all my heart laboring to elect U.S. Grant President of the U.S. for another term. I certainly should not so labor if I thought him capable of offering me an insult because of the color of my skin. With kind remembrances to all your kind circle, yours very truly, Frederick Douglass. All right. So it's kind of interesting. So Douglass and Twain were both supporters of the Fisk Jubilee Singers out of Nashville, Tennessee. So they performed all throughout the United States. They performed all throughout Europe in order to raise money for Fisk University, which Frederick Douglass spoke at least on one occasion on the campus of Fisk University. So in 1875, the endorsements of both Twain and Frederick Douglass were used on a promotional flyer for the Fisk Jubilee Singers, which I'll share in just a moment. This is courtesy of the Smithsonian, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And so on one side of the handbill is a letter, dateline March 8, 1875, from Mr. Mark Twain. He writes, I'm expecting to hear the Jubilee Singers tonight for the 5th time. The reason it is not the 50th is because I have not had 50 opportunities, and I wish to ask a favor of them. I remember an afternoon in London when their John Brown's body took a decorous, aristocratic English audience by surprise and threw them into a volcanic eruption of applause before they knew what they were about. I never saw anything finer than their enthusiasm. Now, John Brown is not in this evening's program. Can it not be added? It would set me down in London again for a minute or two, and at the same time save me the tedious sea voyage and the expense. I was glad of the triumph the Jubilee Singers achieved in England, for their music so well deserves such a result. Their success in this country is pretty well attested by the fact that there is already an ostentatiously pious company of imitators trying to ride into public favor by so wording their advertisements as to convey the impression that they are the original Jubilee Singers. Now that is a very high compliment, shabby and disreputable as such conduct is. It is a most excellent compliment. So on the other side is a note of support from Mr. Frederick Douglass. So Douglass, during the recent, or this is kind of a summary, during the recent visit of Jubilee Singers in Washington City, they were invited by Frederick Douglass to spend an evening with him at his house. This would have been his house on Capitol Hill on A Street. Douglass had attended their concert the previous evening and expressed himself enthusiastically with regard to it. Said he, you are doing more to move the prejudice against our race than 10,000 platforms could do. During the evening, he said, I can remember songs that I heard 50 years ago when a slave. A strong desire was expressed by the singers to hear some of them, and to their delight and the surprise of his family, he sang the following song. I'm not going to read the excerpt of the song, but Douglass shared a song that he recalled. For those of you who know, Douglass played the violin and would play like Old Swanee River and other songs that are today known as kind of plantation songs or minstrel songs, as it were. Douglass Continues, the singers were so much pleased with the new spiritual that they soon caught the melody and joined him in the refrain. And while they were singing it, the notes were taken down by the musical director of the company. Mr. Douglass afterwards said, "It was while singing this song that the idea of escaping from slavery was first suggested to my mind. As the thought grew upon me, the song became more and more a favorite, and I used to sing it about the plantation continually. My master was very well pleased, for he thought I was thinking about heaven, but I was thinking all the time about the other country up north." Thus, under the influence of this song, he at least gained his freedom, and the world gained Frederick Douglass. So it's kind of interesting where Twain and Douglass were both philanthropic in using their influence, using their voice to support individual artisans, individual artists. And so you don't really know much about Mark Twain's support of, let's say, HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. But by Mark Twain supporting the Fisk Jubilee Singers, he's in essence supporting an HBCU. Frederick Douglass supported many HBCUs on the board of Howard University, on the board of Storer College. So I find this to be potentially another avenue of research. But I find that this is, I don't know if I would use the word touching, but I just find this very interesting that for different reasons, but also similar reasons, Douglass and Twain both being Southerners, they had a familiarity and personal connection to the Fisk Jubilee Singers, where Twain being a white American, Frederick Douglass being, a black American who was born enslaved, they understood the emotion of the Fisk Jubilee Singers different than, let's say, someone who was maybe born, in New England and born to, middle class privilege, or some of these, let's say, abolitionists. Nothing against the abolitionists who funded the movement, but Douglass and Twain were kind of self-made men and kind of I'll just skip along because I don't want to get too off topic. All right. But I know you feel me out there. You feel what I'm saying. All right. In October 1879, it was reported that Frederick Douglass and Mark Twain and United States Senator and former Interior Secretary Zachariah Chandler would be canvassing New York and delivering a series of lectures. At this time, Mark Twain was still considered a surrogate for the Republican Party, which some out there probably know better than I. Twain would become like a mugwump, and in the 1880s, where there was a movement essentially saying the Republican Party had not moved and progressed on many issues, one including civil rights, that many Republicans defected and became Democrats, and Twain was included in this group. So at this time in 1879, Twain is still an advocate or ally for, at that time, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was president. All right, so I'll just read this here. It's kind of interesting. Mark Twain, Fred Douglass, and Mr. Chandler are all in the bills for speeches in New York, and negotiations are pending with Senator Carl Schurz to complete the quartet. There's nothing in Mark Twain's humor more ludicrous than this combination. When these four innocents go abroad together with Mr. Evarts, solemnly following in their wake John Sherman, Senator John Sherman, bringing up the rear, and all supported by the moral power of the administration, it will be a spectacle not easily duplicated. All right, in December 1879, Mark Twain attended a breakfast given in honor of poet Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., and letters were read from those unable to attend, and one of the letters that was read was from United States Marshal Frederick Douglass. When Douglass serves as Marshal from 1877 to 1881, he frequently is invited to speak at birthday celebrations, funerals, and is unable to attend, and frequently sends letters instead, and these are read. So I thought this was furthermore reiterating some of the cross connections and associations that Twain and Douglass had, essentially almost with like the New England literati, the New England kind of the transcendentalists, the reformists, the existentialists, and these individuals really helped Frederick Douglass, and he remained loyal with them throughout his entire life. Wendell Phillips being more closely affiliated with Douglass, but nonetheless. All right, so This is a print of Frederick Douglass in his office at City Hall. He served as United States Marshal of the District of Columbia under Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President. Douglass served from 1877 to 1881. So Mark Twain endorsed Frederick Douglass as U.S. Marshal to President-elect James Garfield. As I mentioned in the introduction, Philip Foner in his 1950 biography of Douglass includes this letter, and this is really the foundation up until probably 10 years ago for, if you ask the Frederick Douglass scholar, I can't speak for Mark Twain scholars, but if you ask the Frederick Douglass scholar what was the connection between Douglass and Twain, this would almost be the singular reference. So I'll just read this here. So Mark Twain writes to President-elect Garfield from Hartford, January 1881. Dear sir, several times since your election, people wanting office have asked me to use my influence with you in their behalf. To word it in that way was such a pleasant compliment to me that I never complied. I could not without exposing the fact that I hadn't any influence with you, and that was a thing which I had no mind to do. It seems to me that it is better to have a good man's flattering estimate of my influence and keep it than to fool it away with trying to get him in office. But when my brother on my wife's side, Mr. Charles Langdon, late of the Chicago Convention, that being the Republican nominating convention, which Frederick Douglass attended all of the Republican national conventions from 1876 until 1892. But my brother, late of the Chicago Convention, desires me to speak a word for Mr. Fred Douglass. I'm asked to use my influence consequently. I am not risking anything. So I'm writing this as a simple citizen. I'm not drawing on my fund of influence at all. A simple citizen may express a desire with all propriety in the matter of a recommendation to office. So I beg permission to hope that you will retain Mr. Douglass in his present office of Marshal of the District of Columbia, if such a course will not clash with your own preferences or with the expedience and interests of your administration. I offer the petition with peculiar pleasure and strong desire because I so honor the man's high and unblemished character and so admire his brave, long crusade for the liberties and elevation of his race. He is a personal friend of mine, but that is nothing to the point, for his history would move me to say these things without that, and I feel them too. With great respect, I am, General, yours truly, Samuel Langhorne Clemens. And going back to this, so the University of Virginia special collections, the Albert Small special collections, believe they have the original of this letter. They have the original letter that Frederick Douglass sends back to Mark Twain, thanking him for writing a letter to President-elect Garfield. And I'm not going to include Frederick Douglass's response because it's actually widely known. It's been circulated. Albert Bigelow Payne includes Douglass's letter to Twain, thanking him for this letter to President-elect Garfield in the compilation, the various compilations of biographies that Albert Bigelow Payne did. So this is actually a pretty well-known or pretty well-traveled connection of Douglass and Twain. And so by this time, Twain and Douglass have known each other for at least a decade, if not more so, maybe a decade and a half. All right, so this is kind of interesting. So I stumbled into this researching Frederick Douglass and his bereavement of his over the passing of his first wife. So Douglass delivers an address at Allen Hall in Hartford in January of 1883. This is actually a photo of the Allen Hall in the early 1900s. So it's a little post Douglass's address, but my understanding is like the Monaco Hotel in like the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., the Allen Hotel was the most luxurious 5-star hotel in Hartford at the time. And I'll just get into this. So this is actually from the New York Age, which was T. Thomas Fortune's paper. The Honorable Frederick Douglass lectured last evening at Allen Hall before a large audience. The lecture was under the auspices of the Sumner Club, whose president introduced the speaker. Weed's band, located in the gallery, gave a concert before the lecture. Mr. Douglass's subject was John Brown, and in an interesting vein, he traced the life and works of the man who did so much to hasten the events which led to emancipation of the slaves. One of the finest portions of the lecture was the description of the affair at Harper's Ferry and the fate of the great philanthropist. Mr. Douglass has an easy and pleasing delivery, and this, combined with the attractive style in which the lecture was written, made the occasion one of the great interests. Mr. Douglass was the guest of ex-Governor Jewell and received calls from distinguished citizens, including Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, Charles Dudley Warner, and others. I'm still in the process of researching this lecture that Douglass gave. Some of the questions I have are, was Mark Twain possibly in the audience? Question mark. I know that Matt Seibold has, raised the question of, did Mark Twain potentially attend Frederick Douglass' outdoor emancipation lecture in Elmira, New York in August of 1880? So I don't know if Mark Twain attended this lecture, but I haven't cross-referenced Twain letters, Douglass letters to see if maybe there's some material where they discuss meeting each other. But I believe what occurred is that when Douglass was in town, he was the talk of the town. He was in the company with the former governor. He went to visit the recent governor, recently inaugurated governor. And so leading citizens of the town came out to greet Mr. Douglass, or the leading citizens who were, I would say progressive or allies, who were not afraid to, be seen in public shaking hands with Mr. Douglass. And one of these gentlemen, being Mr. Twain, said, "Oh, I'd like to, go downtown to see my long friend, Mr. Douglass, and see, how is he doing, and ask about his children, and, express his sympathies for the recent passing of his wife." So the context and details of this connection, interaction, meeting between Douglass and Twain is still under research. For those of you who are well studied on the chronology of Twain and Douglass meeting, my understanding is this meeting in January 1883 in Hartford, Connecticut is not included in any current published materials on Douglass and Twain meeting. Twain and Douglass met backstage in Washington in 1885 when Twain was barnstorming with George Washington Cable, giving lectures. So they did meet in the context of kind of supporting each other's lectures or addresses. But as I said, this presentation is really kind of a work in progress, so I don't want to give any misgivings that this is kind of, completed research. The research is ongoing, and this discovery has kind of opened up new questions. So when Douglass is in Hartford in January of 1883, he is in company with former Governor Marshall Jewell. Marshall Jewell was a manufacturer, pioneer, telegrapher, telephone entrepreneur, world traveler, and political figure who served as the 44th and 46th governor of Connecticut. He was the U.S. minister to Russia, and he was the 25th United States Postmaster General, which, interestingly enough, is essentially the United States Post Office under President Grant, who appointed Mr. Jewell postmaster. It was one of the first federal agencies to integrate from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, and today the legacy of essentially Black American employment continues at the United States Post Office. Frederick Douglass worked hand in hand with Postmaster General Cresswell, with Postmaster General Jewell, to essentially say, if there's openings in some of these post offices in the South, I know some leading Black citizens who you should appoint, because in these local post offices have always been, the appointments have been controlled by the party in control of the White House. It's a federal appointment, not a local matter. And this gentleman actually was the chairman of the Republican National Party, so he is a very, very big figure. To compare him to, like, he was a real party insider. All right. So when Douglass lectured at Allen Hall, he, accompanied by Honorable Marshal, former Governor Jewell, called on Governor Waller. Thomas McDonald Waller of New London was an attorney diplomat and the 51st governor of Connecticut, served from January 3, 1883 to January 8, 1885. So he's just been inaugurated, and he welcomes Mr. Frederick Douglass. He's open to to, be seen with him and say, "How you doing, Mr. Douglass? Welcome to Hartford." Mr. Waller began his life as a newsboy. He was orphaned by the death of his Irish parents. He rose to be appointed by President Grover Cleveland to Consul General to London, which he served from 1885 to 1889. He remained active in National Democratic Party politics into the 1900s. So similar to how President Grover Cleveland was a member of the Democratic Party, although Cleveland was a Democrat, he welcomed Frederick Douglass at receptions at the White House. Frederick Douglass had warm things to say about President Cleveland in his autobiographical writing. So although Frederick Douglass was, as the phrase would go, a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, he worked with Democrats that were sympathetic to the plight of Black Americans, and who Mr. Waller was supportive of civil rights legislation within the state of Connecticut. I believe Frederick Douglass would have known this and maybe even said, word to Mr. Marshall, like, "I appreciate, you being sympathetic to our cause, and I, if you ever need anything, I'd be glad to do you a favor." So, something like that. All right. So a little discursiveness here, and I'm going to try to wrap it up because we're at 7:47. So one of the questions that I have that's unanswered is, what was the extent of Mark Twain's connections and or relationships with the Black community in Hartford? Really don't know. There may be a lot there. There may not be a lot there, but it's a avenue of research that I think can be explored, and I think there's some scholars out there that may know some things, and we can start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So this is going a little bit backwards. So Prince Saunders was a teacher, scholar, diplomat, abolitionist, Freemason, and author who sources say was born in either Lebanon, Connecticut, or Vermont. He was the son of a veteran of the Continental Army. During his life, Saunders reportedly studied at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire before teaching at Colchester Academy, which was established in 1803 as the Bacon Academy. And Mr. Saunders helped to establish a school for Black Americans in Boston, Massachusetts, and in Haiti for King Henry Christophe, who was the only monarch of the Kingdom of Haiti. So this guy was a transatlantic figure, and pretty early civil rights leader in pre-emancipation America. His death was noted in newspapers across the country. Here's from the paper in Norwich, Connecticut, talks about his life. So Thomas P. Saunders, I believe, was a nephew or great nephew of Prince Saunders. When Douglass is in Hartford, the Hartford Times says, quote, "The gigantic figure of Mr. Fred Douglass in a short cloak and high-crowned slouch hat was seen on the streets today. His mass of bushy hair is now white, and so is his mustache. Mr. Douglass is the guest of Mr. Thomas P. Saunders." So Mr. Saunders is an interesting figure. So Saunders reportedly was apprenticed as a tailor in Paris. He then comes back to the United States and establishes like a Joseph A. Bank equivalent, or a tailoring business, a clothing shop on the 254 Main Street in Hartford, Connecticut, where he had that business with a brother of his for about 20 years. I believe Mr. Saunders had a integrated, diverse clientele because he would have been top of the line clothes. I do not know if Mark Twain purchased clothes from Mr. Saunders' shop. I have not gone through the Mark Twain receipts, but I do dare speculate that Saunders, being a leading, not only just a leading Black citizen, but a leading citizen, leading merchant of Hartford, Connecticut, that Twain may have known him somehow, most likely in Twain's, activities in life in Hartford, that they had some sort of connection, interaction. So nonetheless, Saunders don't yet know exactly how him and Mr. Frederick Douglass first came to know each other, but they had a close relationship as evidenced by this letter. So Thomas P. Saunders of Hartford writes Frederick Douglass in April 1874, thanking Douglass for sending him a copy of his John Brown lecture. In 1873, Frederick Douglass first began to deliver in public a lecture about John Brown. This was about 15 years after the failed raid on Harper's Ferry. Douglass figured that some of the emotions had cooled down, it wasn't as emotionally charged as it once was, and that Douglass could deliver this kind of memorial address for John Brown, and the public was ready to receive this lecture. So this is a version of the same lecture that 9 years later Frederick Douglass delivers in Hartford, and I'm under the presumption that Mr. Saunders attended Frederick Douglass's address in Hartford. And this letter is included in the Library of Congress Frederick Douglass papers, and is actually included in Yale University's compilation of Frederick Douglass correspondence. All right, so Mr. Saunders was the son of William and Roxana Saunders. His father was a mixed-race native of the West Indies who was living in Connecticut by 1829, and he worked as a tailor. His father was an agent for William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. I do not know if Frederick Douglass knew Thomas P. Saunders' father, but it is likely. Frederick Douglass knew many generations of families, including the Langdons. Frederick Douglass knew Jervis Langdon. Frederick Douglass knew Jervis Langdon's children and corresponded with multiple generations of Langdons. Frederick Douglass corresponded with multiple generations of families. So I believe that possibly Mr. Douglass knew Mr. Saunders' father, who was an agent for the Liberator. And so Mr. Saunders, with his brother, Prince Henry Boyer Saunders, ran a tailoring business on Main Street in Hartford, Connecticut for 2 decades. And just in the interest of time, I didn't include excerpts from city directories that have both Twain and Saunders in them. But Saunders was a pretty interesting figure, and he's buried today in Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford. All right, so another kind of cross connection is Reverend Henry Ward Beecher celebrated his 70th birthday in 1883, and several letters were read, including letters from both Frederick Douglass and Mark Twain. Mark Twain's next-door neighbor in Hartford, Connecticut, was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who Frederick Douglass knew for several decades. And Harriet Beecher Stowe was Reverend Beecher's older sister and a lifelong friend of Frederick Douglass. I was discussing with my friends at the Mark Twain House and Museum before the presentation started. I have to determine, or will hopefully be able to determine in the further research, if Frederick Douglass visited Harriet Beecher Stowe in Hartford, because if he visited Harriet Beecher Stowe in Hartford, it's very likely that he, if Mark Twain was home, maybe went over and they played a game of pool or had some sort of interaction, because those of you who have visited either Harriet Beecher Stowe and or Mark Twain's house in Hartford, Connecticut, you know they are next door neighbors. All right, so that leaves a little bit of time for comments, questions, discussion. For those of you who'd like to reach out, it's my phone number, email. I actually lead Mark Twain in DC Walking Tours, Frederick Douglass in DC Walking Tours. I'm on Twitter. If you like this presentation, I don't know if you do Venmo, that's my Venmo, a cheap little shout out. Also, if you haven't visited the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, please do so. Please subscribe to their Twitter feed, follow them on Facebook, sign up for their email newsletters. I wanted to thank them for having me tonight. I wanted to especially thank Steve Courtney for his time in helping to better understand Mark Twain's connection to the Black community in Hartford. So with that, I guess we'll open it to questions, comments, and I'll put my I'll go on mute for a second.
All right. Thank you so much, John. I know we only have a little bit of time, so I won't be able to get to everyone's questions, but there are quite a few in the Q&A box. We'll try to do a couple. So the first one is, do you have another book planned about Twain and Douglass?
That is a wonderful question, and Twain and Douglass, I think definitely are deserving of like a pamphlet, are deserving of something that like this presentation could be put into an ISBN. I think that it would take a couple more years of research to really understand their relationship, because it requires going into the papers of so many other individuals that they had relationships with. But I do think that, like, there is a significant bibliography on Mark Twain. There are works on Mark Twain that um, place him in certain geographical areas. Like my book, I talk about Mark Twain in Washington. There's a book on Mark Twain and President Grant. There haven't really been that many comparable studies of Frederick Douglass and other individuals, or Frederick Douglass in certain locations. So I think that this would be a great subject. I'm currently trying to work on Frederick Douglass in Western Maryland, but John, can you close your screen sharing? Yes, I'm sorry. Oops. Okay, sorry about that. So yes, hopefully before I turn 45, I can get something out in ISBN form on Douglass and Twain. But I'm not currently working on it now.
Right, we'll look forward to that. Another question, did Douglass visit Twain at his house in Hartford?
That's another great question. I don't have any evidence or documentation of that right now, but if I was doing a historical draft Kings or FanDuel or whatever it is, where you had to make a bet, will evidence emerge that Douglass visited Twain in Hartford? I speculate that he most likely did. And also, if he visited Twain, he could also visit his friend Harriet Beecher, or if he visited his friend Harriet Beecher, he could visit Mark Twain. So the whole saying about, killing the two birds with one stone sort of thing. And I believe he probably did. He probably did.
All right, we'll do just one or two more since we're tight on time. I think this is a great one. If you can pick only one of Mr. Douglass's works, speech or essay, which would you recommend?
That's a great question. Well, Douglass's 1892 biography, Douglass wrote a biography published in 1845, 1855, 1881, and then his 1892 version, he discusses his ministership to Haiti and kind of like gets his side of the story out. His Life and Times autobiography, 1892 version, is the most thorough telling of his life. He gets into the most detail about his escape on the Underground Railroad, kind of gets into his political work. So I would recommend for someone, now it's a pretty lengthy book, but it's available on Documenting the American South, Google Books, Internet Archive. But I would recommend checking out Life and Times by Douglass. Also, there are many. One of his speeches where he talks about celebrating the emancipation of the West Indies in 1857 is where there are many quotables that Douglass gives. It's a very fiery speech. I mean, Douglass's speeches before emancipation, he's really taking aim at slavery. After emancipation, it's more like the self-made man speech. Is an inspirational kind of self-help speech. For those of you looking for, let's say, an inspirational speech, that's a very, very Douglass delivered that more than 200 times. I believe there's some recordings of that on YouTube. In 1894, he gives a speech about Lessons of the Hour, which is kind of about an anti-lynching speech. And there's, I believe, a rendition of James Earl Jones on YouTube reading that. So Douglass and Twain do not suffer from a lack of source material.
That is very, very true. Well, perfect.
We can take maybe one or two more questions if you'd like.
Sure. So one of the questions is what are your next steps in your research on this topic?
Yes. Well, cross-referencing Douglass letters as well as Twain letters. Twain letters are more readily available online in terms of they've been digitized. The Mark Twain Project at UC Berkeley has done a wonderful job. It's a searchable database. So I guess the next step would almost just chronologically trying to put together when we know Mark Twain and Douglass were together in some sort of capacity, whether that's Twain attending a Douglass lecture, Douglass attending a Twain lecture, them meeting in some capacity. And some of that is a little hard to do, but just getting a better understanding of how many times they actually met. And it's a little bit, and not necessarily in a negative way, but it's a little bit of kind of trying to emerge from like muddy waters or emerge out of the mud of trying to pick apart some of these references. And as I showed with this, there are almost more times where a letter from Twain and Douglass are read in a public setting, so they're not physically there, but their words or their thoughts or remembrances are expressed together, even though they're physically not there. So I would also do something where in the chronology you include this is when we know they met or they shared the same, train, they shared the same hotel lobby, but then here are other times where letters were read, and then also then even reverse engineering that, going and trying to find fuller accounts of some of these events and find out what might have been in the letter that Twain wrote, what might have been in the letter that Douglass wrote, trying to then go back and find the actual copies of the letters that they wrote and contributed to these events.
Great. Sounds like a very exciting topic to continue on. So with that being said, we are a little past time. So thank you for taking the additional couple questions. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, John, and presenting this really insightful topic. Thank you to our audience, as always, for joining us at our Triple B Guns series. And make sure you check out either the replay of this recording on our YouTube channel and get ready to follow along for our next few Triple Begins. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful evening.